Every pharmacist learns, early in the job, that the most dangerous thing in a prescription is rarely the medicine everyone's watching. It's the interaction nobody thought to check. Two perfectly safe things combined in a way that quietly becomes something else entirely. A slow chemical conversation happening beneath the surface of two labels that each, individually, carry a clean bill of health. This is the story of a man who spent 40 years protecting strangers from exactly that kind of danger, and who still walked, eyes open, into the one interaction he never thought to screen for. Because it didn't arrive wearing the shape of a medicine at all. It arrived wearing the shape of a bank form. I spent 40 years behind the counter of a pharmacy in Southampton, the last 22 of them as the owner of my own small chain. 3 shops across the city, built up steadily from a single counter I'd taken over from a retiring proprietor when I was 28 years old. Pharmacy suits a certain kind of mind, the kind that wants to check things twice, that treats a missed detail as a genuine hazard rather than a minor inconvenience. And I'd like to think, whatever else this story reveals about my judgment, that I was good at that part of the job for 4 solid decades. I never once dispensed the wrong dosage. I caught 3 separate dangerous interactions in my final year alone, cases where a doctor's prescription looked entirely reasonable on its own and became something else entirely once you checked what else the patient was already taking. A blood thinner sitting quietly alongside a new anti-inflammatory that nobody had thought to flag. A beta blocker prescribed without accounting for a second cardiac medication from a different specialist entirely. I built my professional reputation on exactly that habit of mind. The refusal to evaluate anything in isolation. The insistence on seeing the whole chart before signing off on any single line of it. A discipline I taught to every junior pharmacist who ever trained under me across those 4 decades. Always the same instruction repeated until it became reflex. Never trust a single safe answer until you've checked what else is in the room with it. My wife Patricia died of a stroke 6 years before I met Nica. Quick and merciless the way strokes sometimes are. No warning at all. Gone between one Tuesday afternoon and the next. We'd been married 39 years, since I was 23 and she was 21. 2 young people who'd met at a village dance and never seriously looked at anyone else again for the rest of our lives. I sold the pharmacy business 2 years after that. Not immediately, because I needed the routine of it to survive those first raw months. The familiar rhythm of the counter. The regulars who knew enough not to ask how I was really doing. The small kindnesses of people who'd watched Patricia and me together for years and understood, without needing to be told, exactly what kind of silence to offer. But eventually, once I understood I was running the shops more out of habit than purpose, the whole enterprise having become a kind of elaborate distraction rather than a genuine calling. I retired at 64, with a comfortable sum, careful investments, a paid-off house, and a specific, particular kind of loneliness that I understand now is common among men who spend their whole careers being needed by other people and suddenly find themselves needed by no one at all. The phone stopping its ringing almost overnight, the daily procession of familiar faces across a counter replaced by long, undifferentiated stretches of quiet that I hadn't fully anticipated when I first began planning for this stage of my life, no matter how carefully I'd thought I'd prepared for it on paper. I met Nica on a trip to the Philippines that my daughter Charlotte had actually encouraged, oddly enough, worried that I was becoming too isolated in the big empty house Patricia and I had raised her in, spending too many evenings alone with the television on for company rather than genuine interest, a pattern she'd noticed on her increasingly infrequent visits, and finally raised with me directly one Sunday afternoon over tea. Nica was 30 at the time, working as a pharmacy assistant, of all things, at a small drugstore in Lipa. I'd wandered into looking for aspirin during a bout of travel-related dehydration, the kind of ordinary tourist mishap that felt, in hindsight, like an oddly fitting first scene for the rest of the story that followed. There was something immediately comfortable about the encounter. 2 people who understood the same profession, even at wildly different scales, trading small technical observations about stock rotation and expiry dating that most people would have found deathly boring, and that I found, unexpectedly, Like coming home to a language I hadn't realized I'd missed speaking, a shared professional shorthand that Patricia, lovely as she'd been, had never once shared with me across 39 years of marriage, her own background having been in teaching rather than anything remotely clinical. We talked for the better part of an hour that first afternoon, well past the point any reasonable pharmacy transaction should have taken, and I remember walking back to my hotel afterward feeling something I hadn't felt in the 6 years since Patricia's death, a specific lightness that I recognized, uncomfortably, as hope, the particular hope of a lonely man who stopped expecting to feel it again and finds it arriving anyway, uninvited and entirely welcome. I want to be honest, right from the start, about the 40-year age gap, because I know it's the first thing anyone hearing this story fixates on, and I understand why. I wasn't naive about it. I'd read extensively before ever proposing, forums full of cautionary tales, articles about the specific risks of relationships with such a significant gap in age, financial resources, and life experience, spending entire evenings across those months working through case after case of exactly the kind of exploitation I was determined not to walk into blindly. I built what I genuinely believed were careful, deliberate defenses against exactly the kind of exploitation those warnings described. I kept my properties in my own name. I never gave large lump sums without independent legal review. I had a prenuptial arrangement drawn up before the wedding, properly executed, properly witnessed by 2 solicitors rather than 1, protecting the bulk of my estate for Charlotte's eventual inheritance, a document Nica signed without complaint or apparent resentment, which I took, at the time, as evidence of her genuine good faith rather than simply a sign that she understood, correctly, that the real financial architecture of our marriage lay elsewhere entirely. I did, I want to stress, all the things a careful man is supposed to do. The age gap wasn't the thing that undid me. I'd built genuine, functional defenses there, and those defenses held completely, right up until the very end, the prenuptial agreement standing untouched throughout the entire 4 years, exactly as written, exactly as intended. What undid me was something far more ordinary, something that never appeared on a single one of those cautionary lists I'd studied so carefully. Because it doesn't sound dangerous at all. It sounds like exactly the kind of sensible, loving decision any devoted spouse would make. The trigger came in our 2nd year of marriage, a dizzy spell I had one morning in our kitchen in Southampton. Nothing catastrophic in the end, a minor cardiac arrhythmia that a cardiologist later attributed to a medication interaction I should, with my own professional background, probably have caught myself before it happened. A small irony I've had ample time to sit with since. But in the moment, it frightened both of us badly. An ambulance, a hospital stay, 2 days of tests before anyone could confirm it wasn't the stroke we'd both immediately feared, given how Patricia had died. Nica sitting rigid in the plastic hospital chair beside me for the better part of those 2 days, barely eating, refusing to leave even when the nurses gently suggested she go home and rest. Nica sat beside that hospital bed the entire time, visibly shaken, and I remember her asking me, once the immediate danger had passed, a question that felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of thing a loving wife should be worried about. Edwin, what if something happens to you again, and worse, and I can't even pay the hospital because everything is only in your name? What kind of wife would that make me look like? It was a reasonable fear, reasonably expressed, and my pharmacist's brain, trained for 4 decades to evaluate risk and mitigate it responsibly, saw absolutely nothing dangerous in the proposed solution. A joint current account, separate entirely from my main investments and the properties I'd protected under the prenuptial agreement, funded with a modest monthly allowance for household expenses and, yes, accessible to her in a genuine emergency, without the delay of probate or power of attorney complications. Delays I'd actually witnessed firsthand years earlier, when a colleague's widow had struggled for weeks, simply to access funds to cover an unexpected hospital bill. I remember discussing it with my own solicitor at the time, a careful man named Reginald who'd handled my affairs for over a decade, ever since the sale of the pharmacy business, and even he agreed, It was a sensible, limited arrangement, properly scoped, properly documented, nothing that touched the assets we'd already ring-fenced. It's the kind of thing I'd recommend to any client in your position, Edwin, Reginald told me at the time. A sentence I've turned over many times since, with a bitterness I try not to direct at him personally, since his advice was sound within the narrow frame either of us had thought to give the question. I added Nica's name to that account within a fortnight of leaving the hospital, satisfied that I'd handled a genuine risk with exactly the kind of careful, proportionate response my whole career had trained me to produce. I want to explain something about how a joint account actually works, because I think it's the part of this story that most people, hearing it from the outside, don't fully understand, and it's the part I understand now, with a clarity that came far too late to matter. There was no dramatic emptying of that account, no single moment where I could point to a screen and say, "There, that's the crime." A drained account, the kind you read about in the more sensational stories, is a crime scene, a single violent event with a clear before and after. What actually happened to us was something else entirely, something that never once looked like theft because, under the precise legal terms I'd myself established, it never actually was theft. It was a managed account. It was, over 4 years, simply a lifestyle. The first standing order appeared about 3 months after I'd added Nica's name, a modest monthly transfer to her mother in Lipa, £70, framed to me as a small, ongoing contribution now that we had the means to help properly. The kind of filial support I understood, even then, was culturally expected in ways that didn't map cleanly onto my own experience growing up in a much smaller, more insular English family, where such support, when it happened at all, tended to be occasional and specific, rather than structured as a permanent monthly arrangement. I didn't object. £70 a month felt like a perfectly reasonable kindness for a man in my financial position to extend toward his wife's family. I remember feeling, if anything, faintly pleased with myself for accommodating a cultural difference I'd read about, rather than fighting it the way I understood some less flexible husbands did, congratulating myself, in a quiet, private way, on my own open-mindedness. The second standing order followed within a few months, this one covering the monthly repayments on a motorbike loan for Nica's younger brother Bong, £120 a month, again presented reasonably, again framed as the kind of support that would let a young man in a rural province actually get to and from steady work, rather than remaining unemployed and dependent on the family indefinitely. A framing I found genuinely persuasive at the time, the practical logic of it appealing to the same part of my mind that had once approved sensible business expenditures for my own pharmacy chain. Each individual request, taken entirely on its own, was the kind of thing I'd have agreed to without much hesitation, even from a British in-law in a similar position. I never once, across those first 18 months, sat down and looked at the cumulative shape of what I was authorizing, because each authorization arrived separately, spaced out, never presented as a pattern, only ever as its own isolated, reasonable ask, months apart, each one long enough removed from the last, that they never once registered to me as part of a single continuous line. Beyond the standing orders, there was a steady, less trackable flow through Gcash, the mobile payment system that had become, I came to understand far too slowly, the primary financial infrastructure for an enormous portion of ordinary Philippine life, invisible to me in the way a foreign currency's daily fluctuations are invisible to someone who's never had to actually live inside them. A system I understood only abstractly, as something Nica used to pay for groceries and household necessities, never once appearing on any statement in a form I recognized as requiring the same scrutiny I'd have automatically applied to a checkbook or a card. Nica managed most of the household's day-to-day spending through that system, and I never once, across 4 years, sat down and traced the full flow of money moving through it, never asked for a monthly reconciliation the way I'd have demanded from any junior member of staff handling my pharmacies till decades earlier, back when I'd insist on a full count down to the last coin before anyone was permitted to lock up for the night. I trusted the shape of the arrangement more than I audited the substance of it, Precisely the failure of professional discipline I'd spent 40 years training myself never to commit in any other area of my life. I want to pause here and say something honest about why none of this raised the alarm it probably should have, because I think the mechanism matters more than the outcome. Every single transaction, viewed in isolation, was exactly the kind of ordinary, defensible, even admirable thing a comfortable retired man might reasonably do for his wife's family. A dying mother's medication, though I want to be precise that Nica's mother was not in fact dying, merely elderly and increasingly frail in the ordinary way of a woman well into her 70s, a distinction I only came to appreciate the weight of much later, once I understood how the framing of each request had subtly shaped my own sense of urgency around it. A brother's honest attempt at steady employment, a niece's school fees, arriving as its own separate, modest request about 2 years in, £60 a month, again, entirely reasonable on its own terms. My pharmacist training, the very thing that should have protected me, had spent 4 decades teaching me to evaluate risks, item by item, prescription by prescription, and every single item on this particular chart passed inspection cleanly. What I never once did, not properly, not until it was already far too late, was step back and evaluate the cumulative interaction of the whole regimen, the thing I'd have insisted on immediately for any patient taking 5 separate, individually safe medications that had never once been reviewed together, the exact professional discipline I applied without fail to every single stranger who ever walked through my shop doors and somehow never once thought to apply to my own life. The total, when I finally sat down 4 years in and actually calculated it properly, came to £160,000, drawn from that joint account across those 4 years, every single transaction legally authorized, every single one traceable back to a standing order or a transfer I had, at some point technically approved, either explicitly or through the simple ongoing fact of never once revoking Nica's equal access to an account bearing both our names. A figure that, spread evenly across 48 months, worked out to a little over £3,000 a month, a sum that would have seemed, presented all at once as a single monthly figure at the very start of the marriage, obviously and immediately alarming, and that had instead arrived so gradually, so incrementally, that not a single month along the way had ever once felt like the moment to object. A third recurring request arrived roughly 2 years in, this one covering school fees for a niece I'd met exactly once, at our wedding, a sweet, shy girl of perhaps 11, who Nica described, with real warmth in her voice, as gifted, deserving of a proper education that the family's ordinary circumstances would never otherwise have afforded her. £60 a month, again reasonable on its own, again presented with the specific emotional weight of a child's future, rather than an adult's ongoing need. A framing I found, if anything, even harder to question than the first 2 requests had been. I remember thinking, at the time, that a man who'd built his own career from nothing but a counter and a diploma understood better than most the value of investing in a young person's education, and that refusing such a small sum for exactly that purpose would have made me, in my own estimation, something close to a hypocrite. What strikes me now, turning all 3 requests over together, rather than as the isolated events they felt like at the time, is how precisely each one had been calibrated to appeal to a different specific value I held. The dying mother's need appealing to basic human compassion, the brother's motorbike appealing to my belief in practical self-sufficiency, the niece's school fees appealing to my own hard-won respect for education as the engine of a better life. I don't believe, even now, that this calibration was necessarily deliberate or calculated on Nica's part, in the manipulative sense that word usually implies. I think it more likely reflects the fact that these were, genuinely, the values her own family already held, and that she was simply describing real needs in the language that came naturally to her, language that happened, almost by coincidence, to land precisely on whichever lever I was most inclined to pull. The moment that finally broke through my own denial came almost by accident, the way I understand now, these moments so often do. I was reviewing our finances ahead of a planned kitchen renovation, a project entirely unrelated to any suspicion about Nica, simply the ordinary bookkeeping of a careful man planning a modest home improvement, when I pulled up 4 years of statements on that joint account, rather than just the most recent quarter, intending only to confirm we had sufficient reserves for the contractor's deposit. I remember sitting at my own desk, the statements spread across the screen in a long, scrolling column, and feeling something cold settle into my chest as I began, almost involuntarily, doing the kind of running total I used to do on a busy Saturday shift, adding each line as I went, rather than trusting my memory of the individual. Isolated requests I'd approved one at a time over 4 years, the total climbing faster with each additional month than I'd braced myself for. Past 10,000, past 30, past 80, the number growing with a momentum that felt, by the time I reached the final quarter, almost physically dizzying, an unwelcome echo of that original hospital scare that had started the whole arrangement. I didn't say anything to Nica that evening. I want to be honest about why, because it's the part of this story I find hardest to explain even to myself. It wasn't suspicion exactly, not yet, not fully. It was something closer to disbelief, the specific, disorienting feeling of discovering that a number you thought you understood was actually 10 times larger than the figure you'd been carrying in your head, and needing time to simply sit with that gap before you could trust yourself to discuss it calmly with anyone else, let alone the person at the center of it. I called Reginald, my solicitor, the following week, and asked him to review the full 4 years of statements properly, professionally, the way I should have insisted on doing at regular intervals from the very start, rather than trusting the arrangement to simply manage itself. He called me back after several days with an assessment that has stayed with me, word for word, more clearly than almost anything else from this entire experience. Mr. Chamberlain, I've gone through everything carefully, and I need to tell you plainly, nothing here constitutes fraud or theft in any legal sense. Every transaction was properly authorized under the joint account structure you established. That's precisely the problem. I asked him to explain what he meant by that, and he said, with the particular careful patience of a man delivering news he knows will land badly, you built a legal structure that made this outcome not just possible, but essentially inevitable, once the underlying assumptions about what the account was for diverged between the two of you. There's no crime here for me to help you prosecute. There's only a marriage where two people were operating from entirely different definitions of what that account actually meant. I remember asking him, somewhat desperately, whether there was truly nothing to be done, any avenue at all, some technicality or precedent he might yet uncover with further digging, and he was gentle, but entirely unambiguous in his answer. The structure had worked exactly as designed. It had simply been designed around an assumption that turned out never to have been shared. I confronted Nica that same week, laying the full 4-year total out on our own kitchen table, the same kitchen where I'd had that dizzy spell all those years earlier. The printed statements arranged the way I used to arrange evidence of a dangerous interaction for a doctor who needed convincing their prescription required amending, each highlighted total lined up in careful chronological order. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, whether she understood the total figure that had moved through that account, whether any part of her had ever paused to consider it as a single, cumulative number, rather than a sequence of separate, individually justified requests. She looked at the statements for a long moment, picking one page up and studying it more closely, turning it slightly toward the window light, as though a clearer view might change what it said, and I want to describe her expression honestly, because it wasn't what I'd braced myself for. She wasn't angry. She wasn't ashamed either, not in any way I could clearly identify. She looked, more than anything, genuinely confused. The specific confusion of someone being asked to defend a premise they'd never once understood to be in dispute. The way a student looks when accused of cheating on an assignment they genuinely believed the rules permitted. Edwin, I don't understand what you're upset about. This is normal. Everyone in my town knows what it means when a man like you marries someone like me. The account was for the family. That's not a secret I was keeping from you. That's just what it is. I asked her, my voice not entirely steady, whether she'd ever once considered that I hadn't understood it the same way, whether the difference in our understanding had ever occurred to her as something worth raising directly, rather than simply proceeding as though it were settled. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that has genuinely reshaped how I think about the entire 4 years since. I thought you knew, Edwin. Everyone told me foreign husbands understand this. I never once thought I was hiding anything from you. I thought this was just how it worked, and you agreed by marrying me. I pressed a little further, asking whether her own mother had ever discussed the specific numbers with her, whether there had been some understood figure or proportion that families in her position typically expected. Uncomfortable as the question felt to ask out loud, sitting across the same table where we'd once eaten so many ordinary, unremarkable dinners without either of us ever once raising the subject directly. She hesitated, and then admitted, quietly, that her mother had indeed given her a rough sense of what was reasonable, based on what other women in the community with foreign husbands were known to provide. A kind of informal, unspoken benchmark I'd never once had reason to suspect existed, let alone one that might have been shaping the specific rhythm and scale of the requests arriving in our own account. A whole invisible economy running parallel to the one I thought I understood, discussed openly among mothers and daughters in a language and a context I had never once been given reason to imagine, let alone investigate. I sat with that answer for a long time, turning it over the way I used to turn over an ambiguous prescription, looking for the reading that made the most sense of all the available evidence, rather than the reading I'd have preferred to find. I don't think Nica was lying to me in that kitchen. I think, and I've had a great deal of time since to arrive at this conclusion carefully, rather than defensively, that we had genuinely, catastrophically different operating definitions of what our marriage's finances were supposed to mean. Definitions neither of us had ever explicitly negotiated, because each of us assumed the other already understood the same unspoken terms we did. I understood the joint account as a limited, practical emergency measure. Nica understood it, from a cultural context I'd read about only abstractly rather than genuinely internalized, as the natural, expected mechanism through which a marriage like ours supported an entire extended family, a norm so unremarkable within her own community that raising it as a topic of negotiation would have felt, to her, almost insultingly unnecessary. I separated the accounts within a fortnight of that conversation, working with Reginald to establish a clean, transparent structure going forward, a modest, clearly defined monthly allowance, rather than an open joint account, properly documented, properly agreed by both of us this time, in writing, with translated copies so there could be no ambiguity about the terms on either side. A process that took several long afternoons in Reginald's office, both Nica and I sitting across from him, working through every single line item until we'd built something neither of us could later claim to have misunderstood. Nica didn't fight the change, which surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. She simply asked, quietly, once the new arrangement was in place, whether her mother's monthly support would continue under the new structure, a question asked without any apparent sense of loss or grievance, simply a practical inquiry about the mechanics of an arrangement she still, I believe, genuinely didn't understand as having ever been improper. The marriage didn't end immediately after that, though I want to be honest that something fundamental had shifted between us that neither of us ever fully managed to repair. We stayed together another 8 months, technically married, sharing a home, but operating, I came to understand, from 2 entirely separate and mutually incompatible theories of what our life together actually was, theories that no amount of clearer paperwork could fully reconcile after the fact, a distance that grew, quietly, across ordinary dinners and ordinary evenings, neither of us quite able to return to the ease we'd once shared over stock rotation and expiry dates in a small drugstore in Lipa. We separated formally about a year after that kitchen conversation, amicably in the narrow legal sense, Nica returning to the Philippines with a settlement Reginald and I structured carefully, generous by any reasonable measure, but bounded, this time, by terms we'd both actually discussed and agreed to explicitly, rather than simply assumed. I called Charlotte, my daughter, the week the separation became final, and told her the whole thing, start to finish, the dizzy spell, the joint account, the 4 years of standing orders, The £160,000. Reginald's exact words about nothing having been stolen. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment, longer than I expected, and I could hear her processing it the way she'd processed difficult news since she was a girl. Methodically, without rushing to fill silence with reassurance she didn't yet feel entitled to offer. Then she said something I've thought about often since. Dad, you spent your whole career checking whether two safe things could hurt someone when you put them together. I don't think it ever occurred to you that your own signature could be one of the dangerous ingredients. I told her that was, as far as I could tell, precisely correct, and that I'd never once, across 4 decades of careful professional practice, thought to apply that same scrutiny to a document with my own name on it, rather than a patient's. The blind spot so complete and so specific that I still find it faintly astonishing, turning it over even now. I don't hate Nica, and I want to be careful in saying that plainly here, at the very end of this account, because I understand how easily it could be read as some kind of naive absolution, rather than the harder, more complicated conclusion I've actually arrived at across many months of turning this over. I think Nica genuinely believed, throughout our entire marriage, that she was operating well within the bounds of an arrangement I'd knowingly agreed to. An arrangement that was, within her own community and her own understanding of how marriages like ours typically functioned, entirely unremarkable rather than exploitative. A norm passed down from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, so thoroughly unremarkable within that context that questioning it aloud would have felt, to her, almost like questioning whether the sun rose in the east. I don't think that belief excuses the outcome. Exactly, £160,000 is £160,000 regardless of the sincerity behind the withdrawals, whatever good faith may have accompanied each individual request along the way, and I don't think either of us walks away from this story entirely without responsibility for the gap that opened up between our two private understandings of what we'd built together. But I've stopped needing her to have been simply a calculating opportunist in order for my own losses to make sense. The same way I've stopped needing myself to have been simply a fool, a framing that flattened a genuinely complicated situation into something far simpler and less useful than the whole truth actually was. I've spoken with a handful of other retired professionals since all this settled, men from similar backgrounds, doctors and solicitors and engineers, men trained across entire careers to spot exactly the kind of risk that ruins other people's lives. And I've noticed a pattern among us that I find genuinely instructive rather than merely comforting. We are, almost universally, the worst possible audience for exactly the kind of danger that doesn't announce itself as danger. A man trained to spot a scam sees a scam coming from some distance, recognizes the urgency, the pressure, the request for secrecy that marks the classic con. A man trained to spot a dangerous drug interaction sees the danger the moment two familiar names appear on the same chart, an instinct so deeply grooved it fires almost automatically. None of us, myself very much included, had ever once been trained to see a legitimate legal structure, properly documented, properly authorized, agreed to with genuine affection rather than coercion, as its own particular category of risk, precisely because everything about it looks, on paper and in the moment, exactly like responsible, loving planning, the very opposite of the red flags we'd all spent our careers learning to recognize. I still live in the house in Southampton, alone again now, though differently alone than I was after Patricia died, a loneliness that carries its own particular flavor of humility rather than simple grief, less the ache of absence, and more the quiet, ongoing work of understanding exactly how a careful man ends up here twice, by two entirely different roads. I've taken up a modest amount of consulting work for a local pharmacy training program, teaching newer pharmacists the specific discipline of evaluating a full medication regimen rather than individual prescriptions in isolation, standing in front of small rooms of eager 20-somethings who remind me, more than I'd like, of the young man I was 40 years ago, certain that careful, systematic thinking could protect him from every category of harm he could name. I've started, without quite planning to, folding a version of this story into those sessions when the conversation allows for it, not the specifics of the marriage itself, but the underlying principle, the dangerous, seductive comfort of evaluating any single item as safe, simply because it looks safe standing entirely on its own, disconnected from everything around it. One of the younger pharmacists, a sharp woman named Priya who reminds me a great deal of myself at that age, methodical, a little too pleased with her own carefulness, asked me once, after one of these sessions, whether I'd ever personally been caught out by exactly the kind of blind evaluation I was warning them against, lingering behind, after the others had filed out of the small training room. I told her, carefully, that I had, in a part of my life entirely separate from pharmacy, and that the lesson had cost rather more than any single professional mistake ever could have. She didn't press for details, which I appreciated, but she nodded slowly, the way a good student nods when a warning has genuinely landed, rather than simply been noted and filed away, and I remember thinking, watching her gather her things afterward, that perhaps this was the one useful thing to come out of the whole affair, this small, second-hand transmission of a lesson I'd learned decades too late for my own benefit. I think about that joint account often, not with the anger I expected to feel in the immediate aftermath, but with something closer to professional humility, the particular, specific humility of a man who spent 40 years building his entire identity around the careful evaluation of risk, and who discovered, far too late, that the discipline he'd applied so rigorously to every prescription that crossed his counter had never once been applied to the document that carried his own signature. Nica and I never really disagreed about what that account was for, not in the way an argument implies genuine conflict, both of us speaking sincerely, both of us certain we were describing the same shared reality. We simply never once checked whether our two separate, entirely sincere definitions of it were actually the same definition at all, and by the time either of us thought to ask, the interaction between those two unexamined assumptions had already run its full, quiet, perfectly legal course.